Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody who is attending this webinar. My name is Ilya Linov, and I'm part of the specification team in the United Kingdom. Today, it is my greatest pleasure to introduce you our honored guest speaker, Colin Ball, who is the lighting director at BDP. Before going into detail, please allow me quickly introduce your Signify company for those who are not familiar with us. Signify, previously known as a Philips Lighting. Signify is a global leader in lighting industry for conventional LED and connected lighting, and we operate in more than 70 countries. We're proud to say that Signify is continuously investing in R&D and people to give the best-in-class product system and services for our customers. And we are very serious about driving sustainability through the technology and innovation with only purpose to unlock the extraordinary potential of light for brighter lives and better world. I want to take this opportunity also to briefly introduce you our Pioneers of Light specification portal, which was recently launched and specifically developed for the design community. In the first key section, you will find the configurator tool, which allows you to get access to all product families and easy download all necessary technical information like product leaflets, installation instructions, and Revit files, which was necessary for design community. With the configurator tool, you can fully customize your chosen products. You can adjust key specifications such as housing, wattage, color temperature, and optics to perfectly match your project's requirements. And later, download all technical data for particular luminaire. And next, we move to the section when the portal highlights its multi-brand portfolio. Here you can see there our brands, and also you will find the inspiring real-world case studies that showcase the impact of Signify lighting solutions in a variety of applications. Following that, you can explore exciting innovations where you can stay informed about the latest Signify breakthroughs in lighting technology and design. And I hope that the Signify portal will provide to everybody an easy access to the Signify technologies and products. Thank you very much. And with that, I hand over to our lovely guest, Colin. Colin, the stage is yours.
Okay, I will share my screen. Everyone can see colors of light, 95 to 2025. This is very much, it's a personal reflection. My career covers 3 offices, Spears and Major, Isometrics and BDP, none of whom may actually agree with what I'm saying. So I just want to cover that note. This is very much a personal reflection of looking at how we operate in lighting now compared to how our industry was, and what we how we looked at light and how we used light now 30 years ago. One thing that's of great interest to me, and particularly honing in on the use of color, I think there's a lot that we have now got in technology and ability to do what we want to do in lighting, but we take a lot for granted because of what the technology actually enables us to do. What we don't do is look at the actual fundamentals. So that's part of the underground message, let's say, of what I'm presenting, is a call for us to look and use color in an interesting way, and a more interesting way than what we've seen in the last few years, but I'll explain this in detail. So I entered into lighting. I was an architecture graduate. A lot of our tutors while I was at school were Libeskind and Zaha Hadid graduates, very interested in a lot of the mathematical complexities of the buildings and what potential computer-aided design could achieve in the future. But it wasn't until I, with a minimalist tutor, discovered the work of Louis Kahn, that the relationship between the person, the mind, and the light of the space, the relationship between light reflecting off material and transmitting to the occupants of the space, that I found that there was something really fascinating. And so my entire portfolio for my degree ended up entirely based on lighting. This was helped a lot by a very in-depth trip around Texas, studying the work of Donald Judd and how light was interacting with some of his installations at the Chinati Foundation. This was something that my portfolio and my own design work had a lot in, and I was just very lucky to meet Mark Major, who saw my exhibition and invited me for an interview. So my first project was Blue Water, which at the time was the largest shopping centre in Europe. And it was a major piece of architecture. London had been left desolate after the 80s architecturally by now King Charles, his monstrous carbuncle speech. So modern design was very much sort of untrusted. And the fact that Blue Water was being built was one of the largest investments that the southeast of England had seen for many years. But there was this willingness to look at new technology, what new abilities could bring. So lighting was this exciting new field that was no longer just about lighting supply of luminaires. Architects were getting involved, and in fact Spears and Major was founded on architects looking at light in a different way, not just as a supply or an engineering level. So colour was a major thing that we were looking at that time, even for landscape lighting, or views of how you can create distant views and vistas through a landscape away from the building. But at every point, it wasn't just about illumination levels or white light. There was always this interest in what the properties of light were. So color was fundamental to that. Interestingly, of course, in the 90s, is that our concentration on energy loads or levels, that wasn't what the issue was. The issue for us was to create something new, something that hadn't been seen before. So blue light was one of the most difficult lights to achieve. It was heavily filtered at the time, required a bit more energy. But also at this time, there's a trade secret that Mark Major would strangle me if I was to reveal how this hand drawing was done. Again, pre-Photoshop, being able to render lighting. This was also something that the graphic properties of light was something that we were exploring as well. So this being a hand sketch from around 1997, and it delivered this as a final project. So we were able to sort of translate with much simpler technologies. We just had the choice between metal halide, halogen, and fluorescence. But so the nuances of how we made the differences in the light is we had to choose and find a reason for a particular color to filter the light. So something quite subtly different there. A project that then had to be open by the end of 1999. Again, this lighting scheme has been lost since the O2 has layered over almost like a corporate sort of color banding, and much of this light, probably the light fittings are still there. A lot of the lighting around the O2 now addresses its internal use, the media screen, it's a media-rich environment, but the architecture and the materials are not necessarily illuminated. So this, again, being a fixed architectural scheme, is expressing the tension of the structure, the air volumes, the heat transition, that's happening around the building. And again, it's putting warm yellow light onto a yellow painted structure. This was something we did a fair amount of, which was material resonance, which I'll talk a bit later. Also, there was a use of dichroic glass at this time, which was it meant that not as much heat was being absorbed by the glass. It had an efficiency, but you had this sort of tonality of colors. Yes, you'd select one color, but the tonalities of the colors and adjacencies would appear as part of the design, which was actually a good thing as part of expression. Also, just before 2000, we won a commission for the Zollverein coking plant in Essen. This was an international competition, and Jonathan won it with a lot of the expression of artistic installations. Initially there was a lot of gobo projections. At the time, this was one of the largest LED installations in Europe. And one of the primary features of this was the addition of a reflecting pool through the middle of the coking plant, this being nearly a mile in length. A surprisingly simple detail of just painting the concrete ramp through the middle in bitumen aluminium upstand, leave a hose pipe in it, and 2 days later you have this reflecting pool. But the fascinating feature of this, as you see, there is a blue road that runs through to the left, is saturating an environment where everything is of this monochrome nature. It was surprising how quickly that red would disappear. Within a matter, before 10 minutes were up, it almost had a sodium, sort of a dull orange glow. And it was here that we discovered the importance that your eye is constantly adapting to color. We now know a lot about how our eye sees color, but that if you exhaust or overemphasize one color, your eye needs to recover from that. So any color that you see, you need to have it calibrated against another. So the addition of the blue road was there to maintain the red. And it was very much off the success of that Wilkinson Air were aware of that project that we had in Germany. So they invited us onto the Magna Science Adventure Centre in Rotherham. Ironically, almost you could say it is the opposing factory from the Second World War. But this was a steel plant in Rotherham that had literally just been left closed. Site inspections at the beginning of the project, Jonathan mentioned even finding gloves of the workmen literally the day the factory closed. That was it, they were left. Wilkinson Air had this genius scheme of inserting a museum by a series of elements and bridges. So as much as possible, the atmosphere of the steelworks was to be kept as it was. And it was here, the darkness of it, the solid shafts of light, sunlight coming in, was again utilizing a color and making it as a statement. And it was interviewing the local residents that would talk about the living factory and this warm fire glow emanating out. So that red ambience was a key feature of the space from the very beginning. But also, in order to enter into that darkness, there was introduction of a particular light room, an ability to adjust your eye, enable the your iris to relax before you stepped into the museum proper, so your eye is pre-adjusted. And it was in this space with just this one single red square on the floor, that none of the light meeting the edges of the room. The room actually had no distinct edges at all. It was only I realized just how invisible this perimeter of the space was. The people in this image are actually screaming their heads off, because when I clicked the camera, they had no idea I was there, even though I could see them as clearly as daylight. So I was very aware then at this time of this unique property of red light. and how it behaved in a very different way to blue light, and the differences. So being able to actually just finish a scheme and observe how people behave and how people behave differently in each of the spaces between the blue lit areas, the red lit areas, was actually, a very lucky opportunity of sort of almost conducting live experiments on the public. So yeah, one other feature of the air zone, actually, that this was the color that you're seeing here is all from the lighting. This area in particular was only aluminium, white, metal, grey. There was no material for physical colour. And it was here, as we were looking at the transitional different conditions of air, that we were looking for a storm condition. And so literally for 2 days we're expressing, trying to pump colours through. What is the colour of a storm? And it was the benefit, the fact that no material here had any colour, that we were able to remove all colour from the space. And it was only when we got to this absolute grey that that sense and feeling of a storm emerged. So I could see that there was differences. We were also using a lot of colour in our schemes and sort of looking for why, research papers, etc. There is this fantastic book that I would recommend everyone to go and find. It's edited by Trevor Lamb, but it's a series of joint presentations of anyone that uses colour. It's a combination of artists, psychologists, linguists, historians, all talking about their particular aspect of colour. And Trevor Lamb himself has a theory of almost like a politics of colour and sociology, that a society constantly moves through a period of sort of, he calls it roundhead to cavalier, that we have this love of saturated colours, our sense of colours become more complex, and then we become very neutral, and then occasionally black and white, and then the primary colours reappear. This cycle being about a sort of 12 to 20 year cycle. But this book, if there's anything you want to know about colour, the biology, anything about it, art history, it's all here. And this has been very much a motivator. And seeing some of the things that were written in there is having a studio to experiment with. We could, stay late into the night, put gels on fittings, and experience exactly what happens when one color transits to another. And it was here doing one study. We'd been using a lot of red and blue, but it's like, what's happening to the green end of the spectrum? And this was for a television studio. So just conducting a live experiment again, I started to put coloured coloured gels onto fluorescent lamps. But I couldn't even complete the installation. Within 10 minutes, everyone in the room was violently complaining about how sick they were being made to feel. So there's something going on in the biology or an immediate physical response to this colour in particular. And again, in later years, conducting surveys across Europe and America, we've discovered that, yes, green and yellow are sort of the least popular colours used when they are selected. But there's another property which is about photography and just the human eye itself. Is this photograph, when I took it, the room was like a luminous pink. There's a magenta hanging in the air, but the photograph just shows that there is a yellow mix in a blue ambient background. So also being aware that there's something different in how our devices, how we see color through recording versus what's actually happening in our biological eyesight. So the other part that was a major revelation was the association of culture and what different parts of the world and their associations with color can make a difference. And this happened in a meeting where we had a glass paneled roof, and you can see it's roughly leaf shaped. Burjuman in Dubai at the time was before many of the towers that you see in Dubai now. The Burj Al Arab had been finished, and the World Finance Center were two unique towers that stood by themselves in a desert. You can barely see them now. So we were looking at, this is one of our, this is my first engagement with the Middle East. So the fact that the roof had this glass, like a richness of the iron glass, I was looking at it as backlighting this glass in green and keeping that reference. And it really caused a ripple with the client and the public about the fact that we were lighting their building green. Culturally, this has been something not seen outside of a mosque. Again, the association of green with the Prophet, with Muhammad, with life, with water. There's an extra spiritual dimension, which I'll come back to. We tend to have a bit of a relationship to blue of that in Christianity. And so for many years, I think about 3 years, Bergerman was my life, regular visits in the Middle East, and really using large floor plates, knowing that there was a lot of direct sun being allowed in, but also minimizing contrast, making sure ceilings were able to glow, but then looking at the tonality of those ceilings, whether you were visiting in the morning, there was a peak lunchtime, there was an evening setting. So, and also looking at if there was a more restauranty area, fine evening dining, we were looking at, again, constantly increasing the warmth. So one end was, sort of bright, coolly lit, and the more of an area that had an evening setting, it would go to this warm sort of golden quality. But there was a very strange piece, and this was again based in Middle Eastern culture, and a lot of our astronomical observations are based on Islamic notation and the origins of algebra. Is we had an observatory which was the central space of the whole shopping centre. So this was a declaration that this space should be nighttime all the time. So, but we found this sort of gold to violet to purple had this experience, or kept the space as this sort of rich, glowing nighttime environment. And it was here to illuminate that night sky. The stars, yes, the smaller ones have some fiber optics in, but the larger holes are literal drilled holes through to the daylight, the sunlight through to, that's natural light pouring through. But also the color and the paint, what is the color of the night sky? So this was using deep violet cold cathode with a combination of red and blue, so that we were able to avoid red and blue mixing to come up to a bright magenta. We were keeping the colors deep to a blue. So it was giving us a different sense of depth that really showed, again, there was a resonance to the paint finish as well as the light hitting it, but that was expressing itself in the shape and the form as well as the sort of perceived distance. So again, the color that you're looking at is as much based on the color next to it as well as what the color of the light is on it. So that going from one dome was an influence in our work with St Paul's Cathedral, a mostly halogen scheme, but one again that utilized the warmth, focused on the warmth, the gold details that have been applied to only certain areas, but actually understanding where the light wasn't from the natural light, looking at Christopher Wren's original details, but then just bringing a more modern understanding of where people needed to read more. Much more light was added to the nave than to the western end. But again, the tones of the light were very specific to the original tones of the materials, so shades of warmth. The one thing that we did learn here, or we were enabled to give, was the cathedral had spent many years just having lighting added to it bit by bit, and the scheme had developed over the remains of previous installations. So this was the first opportunity to implement as one single lighting control network. So the actual clergy were able to embrace full theatrical performances for the ceremonies, so particularly for the First of Advent and other ceremonies in Easter, where they could literally plunge the cathedral into darkness and bring that illumination. But again, one thing to notice is when we get to the very low levels of light, we start seeing this preponderance towards the red end of the spectrum again. Going back to the Middle East, I'm working at isometrics at this point, and we're invited to look at the Chakrin Mosque in Istanbul. Quite happy to say this is the first mosque in the world designed by a woman, and going into the chandelier details, the warmth, the gold within, the actual inscription in the crystal is from the Nur of light within the Quran, which describes almost like the equality of all people, that we're all parts of the same light. And the controversy here, almost in inverse to what we'd first experienced in Dubai, was to light a mosque with now blue light, but this was sort of a contemporary interpretation of a traditional Ottoman place of worship. But with this sort of pure aluminium roof, I was looking at the blue to give this sort of resonance to the sky, so that the material was almost like dissolving, but had this relationship to the incredibly warm light that we had down to the floor. And as you can see, as you go down to the lower floors, the warmth increases. But this idea of the warmth counteracting the blue, but keeping this sort of spiritual element and the silver materials of the roof to sort of shimmer with the sky, was our reason for doing it. But there were many articles written about how blue light had been used for the first time on a mosque rather than green, and what the meaning of this was. Another project that I spent quite a few years in is the Museum of Islamic Art, Qatar. This was I.M. Pei's last project he was brought out of retirement for. And the museum is an incredible collection of the entire history of Islamic art from across the world. So it spans 5 continents, but also centuries, 12 centuries of art. And so being able to see all of the art in one place, but having incredibly sensitive artifacts, some Qurans that were 800 years old, we knew that we had to have this shielded and protected environment, but we had to reveal texture, but we had to keep a sense of orientation. Again, using darkness as part of the design, but not feeling lost or terrified. As sort of a safe level of darkness is, we developed on site this technique of aligning the shadows, so that your sense of orientation is, yes, we would look at the display, make sure that artifacts were 50 lux maximum, etc. But we would then align any of the spare fittings so that there was a general perception that the light was coming in from one direction and was washing all artifacts in a similar way. So you see the shadows on the right line up with the accents on the left. Also, as you are coming down to these lower levels of light, again, noticing this preponderance of the warmth in the materials and the materiality. So I'm still using color, but I've started to look at color, how it's used in daylight, and actually getting to some really minimal detailing. One of these being the exhibition at the Design Museum, where John Paulson, in the middle of an exhibition of his work, is an installation of one of his most minimal spaces. So the only light in this space, in the room, is from a bench where, amusingly, the lighting detail is at the place of heaviest gravity. But the room itself is behind a 50% gauze, so the room can appear or disappear, become solid disappear through this gauze. So the daylight is constantly changing, so the warmth of the room is constantly changing and in balance with it. So I do like to point out to people that this is a white light scheme, but there's very little actual white light in it. But that same technique also with John Pawson at the same time started to use on yachts. If you want to talk about contrast, going from bright spaces, exterior to interior, a yacht is a very small confined space, but within seconds you can go from Mediterranean sunlight to a very dark interior. So actually positioning each and every lamp, and in a yacht, similar to aircraft, every weight of every element reduces the efficiency, of the boat itself. So you have to absolutely put the least amount of things in. Is the detailing that we had was always there to just help the eye relax slightly. So the internal panel is a bright wash to the opposite wall. Inside, that's artificial lighting underneath the staircases, again utilizing the sense that daylight's coming in further. But even here in this tiny space, we're still putting this sense of daylight reflecting upwards, covering the windows with a warm light down to the wood, and again sort of cool light onto crisp white materials with extra warmth, and again a material resonance. We're looking at whatever is the best light on that material, is that light is dedicated to that part. Is with working in isometrics, James Turrell had a relationship with London European works, would be worked through the detailing and the installation, etc., through isometrics for Turrell. So one project commission was One Hyde Park, where the public vicinity was to be an artwork, and the actual by using Turrell, they were able to, demonstrate that they were delivering public art as well as having a nighttime installation. So there was a lot of detailing with Richard Rogers Architects, getting Turrell's sort of panels of light sort of embedded into this all glass structure. Much of the idea being to bring the sky from the city environment, bringing the sky down to the ground. But also through Turrell, we were able to influence many of the materials, the inky black slate, being able to walk across this sort of skimmed reflecting pool to the entrance. But it was through Turrell's work and the exterior that then influenced the opposition of much of that blue light to the gold and the levels of gold within the interior. But again, still with a Rogers building, not many places in the ceiling to hide light fittings. So much of the light is actually emanating up from the floor, giving the space actually a sort of candlelit, more traditional atmosphere. So one other aspect of color emerges again in this difference in digital and real biological color that we see with our eyes. And working with Zaha's in this gallery, which is in Chelsea Harbour, there's lots about this project that's created in the virtual environment in the 3D realm. But lighting technology wasn't quite ready for this at the time. This is probably one of the last halogen cold cathode combination schemes. It was just emerging as LEDs were just allowing us to almost use warm light, but maybe not quite. But this was something that we knew was, yes, it's a Zaha installation, but it's also a bathroom showroom. And one of the most important things about bathroom showroom is that people are observing their own skin. So the warmth of the interior was a very important thing, even though we knew that the architects didn't necessarily require it. But the warmth is there for the human beings occupying the space. As long as we've delivered all the same levels of warmth, the photographer coming along can adjust and remove it. So you see quite a wide difference between what we delivered what we brought into the space for it to be a physical space, but also the initial requirements wanted this sense of blue, water, rippling, etc. within the space, which is again, we were talking a lot to them about biology and just how we see and what the interaction of colors are. So in the model, you have this very, the light is white, it's flat. But actually, in reality, yes, there is daylight coming in on one side. We're not providing flat lighting, but sharp accenting lighting to the display. But we also have artificial light counteracting the daylight. So yes, we're talking about monochrome white light, but in actual fact, there's a whole host of yellows, oranges, blues, what is the natural color of daylight. All of these things, color is embedded, which leads me to one of my favorite images. And I love showing this in public and asking the question, how many colors can you see? But my answer to everyone is none, zero. You're looking at the refraction of light through fur, water, ice, and air. There is no color in this image. So that started to record, and this started almost like as a briefing note for junior designers about where to use what lamp, where the efficiencies were, and how we would program in this control shift. You'd use metal halide, you weren't able to dim them, but they gave you the most efficiency and they gave you that crisp white light, and then you transfer to more power hungry halogen, but you could dim it really low. And that evolved by the time I joined BDP into actually an experiential diagram where it wasn't just about the time of day, but also the position. So that blue light being above your head, but towards the evening, pools of light, that increase of warmth, increase of contrast is a very interesting thing. Is actually your horizon line is the thing that's really mattering here, but also understanding and responding to daylight. One of the secret gifts that's in this diagram is also daylight saving, daylight harvesting. You can just see once you go above 200 lux to the left, if you're using daylight, you're relieving almost 40 to up to 60% of the energy consumption out of the lighting scheme. But again, this is something which this is using color. It's all embedded in white light, but it's practically invisible to those that are occupying the space. So using this is something that's applied very subtly, uh, as much about orientation, but also the materials and the recommendation, how we get involved with the project. So Paddington Station, as a scheme that needed to increase its dwell time. It had never been designed originally as a retail space or a space to dwell. So the first thing we asked for as the lighting designers was timber at the horizon line, was the warmth of a material that we could resonate. And even up to the end of the project, this is one of the few daily atriums that we were still debating whether to actually have the lighting on during the day. And this was how powerful that effect is 90% of our visual stimulation is above and below the horizon line. So the fact that the vertical warmth around the space and the resonance to the materials is the warmth, that's how the occupants feel. So without that warm light on, the space becomes very cold, very grey. Again, our sense of daylight in London or in Britain generally is a lot grayer than other parts of the world. But also utilizing daylighting detail from the original Grimshaw scheme with Spears and Major of the 90s, but actually taking out what had been sky blue cold cathode, replacing it with 4000K LEDs. We were still able to give, during the day, this ability for daylight to appear it's transmitting further into the building than it actually is. But now with this warmth of the perimeter, really play up the contrast and dynamism of that. So we've taken this idea of the materiality and the warmth and resonance, maximum reflection and glow from the materials. We've taken this even a step further, and again, just as LEDs are allowing us to now, we're ever increasing the warmth in the evening. And this scheme that we did for UCL, I'll point out, has no downlights in it, no bollards, no columns, but it gives a controlled illumination, but a level of accent any and everywhere it's needed. But the other thing that you may not notice here is that you're looking actually at 4 different color temperatures of lamps. We have gone through 3000, 2800, 2400, etc., in order to balance and tone this space. And that being part one of the project, the later part, even for the interiors, is with the new student centre. We took this strategy of the daylight where it's coming in, not putting artificial lighting where we knew there was enough daylight, but also using, if there was contrast requirements, keeping the light on for accents, changes of level, but actually pulling back all the ceilings, reducing the ceilings to maximum 60% of the interior, giving you this very like solid form, but warmth to the timber, warmth to the floor in the evening if it's required. But again, only placing the lighting when and where, but also the tones of it to the tones of the material that they're illuminating. And this is something that I find actually a lot of architects really appreciate us for what we're doing. Is we're clearing the ceilings out, and the more you can give a concrete stroke or a clean smooth finish to stroke, the happier they are. But again, all of this is a white light scheme. I'm showing you gold and blue images. This is what you see in the photography. None of this is noticeable to the member of the public, and this is one of the reasons why. I usually like to ask a room in public, everyone to do a show of hands, because this image very famously was the most forwarded image in 2015. It divides the room 50-50 each and every time, and no one can quite believe what's going on. But there's a greater level of weirdness going on about this image. Is essentially it is a combination of mid-tone greys, but a mid-tone grey that's slightly to the gold, a mid-tone grey that's slightly to the blue. So that's also happening not just on the dress, but in the background at the top corner and the bottom corner. So your brain visual system is deciding whether this photograph was taken indoors, outdoors, in the morning or the evening. And what I've discovered, as having met the dress, is even though I have met the dress and seen it, I still see the wrong colours. And there's nothing I can do to change it because my visual cortex has recorded that image. And there's a lot of what we know as constancy. If I said to you that the a can of Coke has one shade of red, we'd all be thinking of a different shade of red, but we all think of that one color. It doesn't matter then what other colors are shining on it, it will always be that same shade of red. So what was interesting this evening, again, discussions of color, was I was talking about when I was working with Terrell, how he spoke about his combination of colors, and there was this point of yellow to green that he would never cross in his sculptures. He would take red, purple to blue up to this point, or he would go through blues to greens up to this point, but he would never combine the two. And I mentioned that it was interesting that this is also the point of the peak fovea. It's the midpoint of our actual color vision. And David Batchelor, another artist publisher of Chromophobia, looked at me and just thought I was completely mad. And he had based much of his career on exactly this color, which is the point where green turns to yellow, yellow turns to green. And we've started discovering this actually appearing a lot more at the moment. Now, we were there, I was presenting because we'd actually looked at as a light festival in Cambridge, and we'd contributed a gender sensitive installation where through a website people could record what their gender was, which was the start of a topic that we now know has been debated for many years. And of course it started the whole debate of the culture of, do we see blues as a masculine or red as a feminine color? And again, that has a historic and a social change that opens another layer of debate as soon as you start talking of colors. Through this as well, language and linguistics is this is now being challenged a fair amount, but Berlin and Kay have said that there is an inherent pattern in languages around the world as they increase in complexity, that as soon as color is described, red is the first color that's often described. You then get this interchanging between yellow, green, and finally a society might get around to describing blue. Ancient Greece being famous for being a culture, even though they used blue pigment, they didn't actually have blue as a term of recognition. So I'll show you this yellow-green interaction. And if you look at this image, this is an artist's impression of what's going on in our fovea. But you might become aware that you're actually looking at a series of green and yellow dots. Well, you're not. You're actually looking at one stable color. That's your eye deciding on whether you're looking at yellow or green in front of your eyes. That's your actual processing system deciding, because this is the color exactly at the midpoint. But according to your language description, your brain will decide what it is that you're looking at. But our first reason for wanting to use this image was to describe actually this unique property of blue, is that at the highest point of focus in your fovea, our evolution decided to pinpoint light to get our accuracy, the vast majority of our eyesight from our fovea for the point of accuracy. It is just 2% of our vision at this high point of accuracy. There is no blue sensitivity in it. So because of the focus on the wavelength, blue was surrendered slightly. So there is a fuzziness and otherness to blue, a diffusion, which again mixed with daylight, you can see in the history of architecture around the world is a uniform sort of culture where blue has this dazzling luster that is equivalent to gold. We call this the Blue Mosque, Sultan Ahmed in Istanbul, but a close look at the Iznik towers, you see there's nearly as much red pigment in the towers as there is blue. Similar thing with Saint-Chapelle in Paris, a dazzling blue interior, but again, look closely at the windows and you'll see there's as much red pigment in the windows as there is blue. Blue hangs in the air and has an ambience, but red stays fixed. But there's another property of red that also has its uniqueness. So as you see, what we're seeing now is that our eyes are focused and evolved to pinpoint this yellow-green wavelength of light. So red and blue are surrendered slightly, but then our eye has a different set of properties for each one. So we have astronomers loving red because our nighttime vision has gone very much to a much greater sensitivity to blue. It doesn't have sensitivity to red. So our irises stay wide in a red light environment. And this diagram that we had evolved many years ago, we're now including it to nighttime, minimizing sleep disturbance. In the last year, we've been commissioned on 5 separate bat studies. An important thing that we have to say here is this nighttime environment is something of, let's call it firelight, or this increasing tendency towards the red, because again, cultural association cannot be separated from, particularly in the West. China is slightly different. Red has a distinct property to longevity and good health, but in the Western world, we still have a problem for recommending red light to city districts or road lighting, even though we are discovering more and more every year. There are more papers coming out on the near infrared and the red light and the properties of it. But one thing I will show you, which is from a live image, which I remember being red-blue. This was taken, but even in black and white, you can see the difference in the blue light that reflects from the outer layer of your skin, showing all the damage to the skin, whereas red light reflects from the innermost layer of your skin, showing the smoothness of it. So there is a distinct age difference to the wavelengths and how they're reflecting off you. That's something which is also I've seen as a parent, and from a conference in the Atacama Desert, I experienced pure starlight at 2 in the morning. But what was interesting was that even though you could see with great accuracy any of the trees or the rocks in the distance, anyone walking up to you, you couldn't see anything about them. They were black shadows in this silvery landscape. But again, here you see the difference in red. Suddenly you can see mine and my colleagues' faces and hands in that environment. Actually, just as we're talking about the resonance of material, when lighting ourselves at very low levels, we're talking about the resonance of our own bodies. Now, that is actually something that we then discovered we're already using. There's a number of box parks around the country. And part of the philosophy of the box park is that it is nighttime entertainment center. Yes, it's visually interactive, but we've developed a system where all the materials inside the space are black. There is very little reflectance, if any. If it's not black, it's raw wood. But again, in the programming of the light, the fact that there's any white light at all inside the space is just spill light coming from the signage and the food. We only have 5 lux of red light pouring down on people, so you are literally in a space where people are glowing in this warm environment. But also going back to white light and how we use red embedded completely within the white light, again to the late evening setting. Yes, this is a reference to bees and honey, so we've gone straight into 2400K. We're currently looking at 2200K, 1800K LEDs for other installations at the moment, but also coming back to a sense of heritage and actually how we're able to influence material and the environment around us is not just something that's new. Working with Georgian interiors, we've looked at, again, integrating daylight, seeing how the Georgian, the original scheme was, and actually just bringing that back to a minimum level, maybe having to use hidden invisible details to increase a sense of safety or illumination to the floor. We've actually got over 200 lux on that deep red carpet on the staircase. But what we're looking at is, again, managing the eye coming in from daylight, moving into the auditorium, and just focusing and placing light exactly just where it's needed. So using the artwork, the art collection to reflect light down into the space, but actually bringing back how the architect had originally designed the space, even including flambeaux on the outside, but understanding that as you're stepping into the space, we're using minimal light, we're using cut glass crystal to diffract the light, so we're not absorbing any, but we're just distributing the light either upwards to the ceiling or down to the floor, but using the records of other homes that the architect had designed. We were able to track down an original light fitting in a stately home, and Jono of my team worked very closely with SUG, some of the manufacturers, to bring back much of the detailing and of that the original hand cut techniques. But what's fascinating as you come into the auditorium is, again, this increase of warmth of the gold, but also many different finishes were checked, for the chair finish, the carpet finish, and you see this preponderance of red. So that even as we are bringing an increase of red into the wavelengths of the light, and you see inside the reflected light from the letters of the chairs is actually providing safety light and access for people to get to their seats, etc. It was this rich, it was this redness of the velvet that actually, again, increases as you get to these darker and lower levels of light. So I'll leave you with this, which is an observation from Mark Rylance, one of our greatest actors, about the preponderance of red and its prevalence in our theatres. Thank you very much.